mom married Dan's dad, I was 14. I remember my initial reaction to the news. I was angry. My mom tried to convince me that it was the right decision for both of us, but all I did was grumble and complain. Dan was a year older than me, and our new stepbrother didn't thrill me. He and I argued all the time over the smallest things. He was a pretty quiet and reserved guy, and I always felt like he looked down on me. Many years have passed, but even now I remember those early. Our parents tried their best to get Dan and I to get along, but nothing worked. He was always in his room or out with his friends. We barely talked to each other. I thought I could never treat him like a brother. But the strange thing is, time changed everything. We both matured, and our relationship started to become different. I'm not a teenager anymore, but sometimes I catch myself thinking how different it all is. Dan has changed. I have too. The last year has been particularly interesting for us. From the moment I graduated from college and came home for a while, things started to look different. Now I was noticing how Dan had become more confident, less withdrawn, and something about the way he looked at me seemed different. It felt like we weren't just half brother and sister anymore, but I tried to ignore it. Our parents had recently gone on vacation for 3 weeks, and it was just the two of us in the house. It changed everything. It all started one of those lazy summer evenings. Dan and I stayed home, and the evening seemed normal. Pizza, TV, some movie. We sat on the couch in the living room, and everything seemed the same as it always did, until one moment. We were watching some old action movie when Dan suddenly started talking. He asked something I didn't expect to hear at all. Have you ever thought that we're not really brother and sister, are we? His words made me freeze for a moment. It was an unexpected. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to smooth over the awkwardness. We're still family. Dan grinned too, but there was something different in his eyes. Yeah, but, we're not biologically related, he added. It's just a thought out loud. I tried to ignore it, but after that conversation, there was a tension in the room. It hung in the air, despite our attempts to get back to the movie. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Now I began to notice how close we were sitting to each other. That moment was probably the beginning of what would later become a challenge for both of us. We started acting differently. And even though I tried to forget that conversation, it kept running through my head. A week went by, and we both tried to act like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Every day, I noticed small things more and more. The way he looked at me, the way we casually touched each other, the way we talked. And every time I felt. One night, I was home alone, and he came home late. We sat in the kitchen, just talking about nothing. But then, out of the blue, Dan took a step toward me. He stood closer than usual, his face so close to mine that I could feel his breath. And it was weird, but also exciting. He looked at me in a way he'd never looked at me before. And that look said more than any words could. It was the moment I realized that we both felt something forbidden. We'd both tried to deny it, but now it was revealed. Nothing happened that night. Almost. We were on the verge, but at the last moment, I stopped myself and pulled away. I told him it was wrong, and he agreed. But after that moment, things got even more complicated. After that night, Dan and I both tried to keep our distance. I felt like our relationship had gone too far, and I knew we couldn't afford to cross the line. But the more I tried to avoid him, the more this tension grew. One day, we both found ourselves in the kitchen. I was making dinner. We barely spoke, but his presence was literally felt on a physical level. I tried to act normal, but my thoughts kept going back to that night. When I finally put dinner on the table, he suddenly stood up and walked over to me. I froze when he touched my hand. It was a light, almost innocent gesture, but in that moment, it seemed very meaningful. "We can't keep pretending that nothing is happening," he said quietly, his voice serious. "It's driving me crazy." I tried to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. He was right. Ever since this strange attraction had started, I couldn't think about anything else either. It wasn't right, but something inside me said we couldn't ignore it anymore. We were on that edge again, but this time, neither of us tried to stop the other. It was the moment when all of our attempts to be normal came crashing down. From that moment on, the boundaries between us were completely erased. A few weeks passed, and things became even more confusing. We both knew that what was happening between us couldn't go on forever, but at the same time, we couldn't stop it. We started spending more time together, talking at night like we never had before. Although we didn't discuss it directly, our actions spoke for themselves. I tried to act like everything was normal. I went to work. I went out with friends. But every time I came home, I knew he was there, that there was more. I'd catch myself thinking about the future, but then I'd immediately stop. It was just too weird. At some point, I realized that we had both become hostages to this situation. We realized we couldn't go on like this, but we didn't know how to go back. It was like a trap, with no way out. One evening, we were sitting on the veranda, drinking coffee in silence. Finally, Dan spoke up. "We can't go on like this any longer. It's not right. We have to do something about it." His words cut me to... "I know," I whispered, trying to hold back the tears. "But I don't know how to stop it. It's just out of control." We both knew it couldn't go on, but taking the first step back was incredibly difficult. After a long pause, Dan said, "We need to tell our parents. They need to know." The idea seemed crazy. Tell the parents? How would they react? What would they think of us? But Dan was sure. It was the only way to make things right. We had to be honest. This conversation was hard, but necessary. As hard as it was, we both realized that we could never move on otherwise.